A body lay cold, yet the umbrella beside it was bone dry. Welcome to Rust Evidence. I am your host, Silas Wren. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments mean the world to me. I always love reading them. Now, let's begin. Chief Inspector Maigret sat at his usual place near the fogged window of the Brasserie Dauphine, a short walk from the Quai des Orfèvres. It was mid-afternoon, and the weather outside had been sulking all day. Drizzle, not quite rain, yet persistent enough to dampen coats and leave pavements slick and shining. He lifted his glass of beer, not so much to drink as to feel its coolness against his fingers, while his pipe rested unlit beside him on the table. His eyes were half on the window, half on nothing at all as he let the rhythm of the street soak into him. Cabs passed with a hiss of wet tires. A flower seller rearranged wilting blossoms under a patched umbrella, and a group of students hurried across the boulevard, their laughter oddly loud against the muted afternoon. He wasn't on duty. Or rather, he was always on duty, but not with purpose. This was one of those pauses in his life, a rare hour without immediate demands, when he could lean back and let Paris breathe around him. His wife would be waiting at home, perhaps preparing her simple supper. He pictured her in the warm kitchen, sleeves rolled back, the steady comfort of their routine. He might have gone home early. Instead, he lingered, perhaps because the air outside carried a peculiar restlessness, a weight he couldn't quite name. Across the café, a man in a dark coat stood drying his hat with a handkerchief, shoulders hunched, eyes on the floor. Maigret watched without watching. He had trained himself not to stare, not to pounce on details like a hound, but to absorb them the way one absorbs the damp, slowly, imperceptibly. It was always in such moments, when nothing seemed to happen, that something stirred. The waiter brought another beer unasked, placing it with the faint smile reserved for regulars. Maigret nodded, struck a match and lit his pipe at last, filling the corner with the familiar aroma. It grounded him, and then, almost inevitably, the telephone in the corner rang. The proprietor lifted it, looked about, then raised his chin in Maigret's direction. He didn't sigh, though the urge was there. Rising heavily, he accepted the receiver, pipe in one hand, the faint smell of beer and tobacco still clinging to him. The voice at the other end was hesitant, not one of his men, but a uniformed sergeant, young and uncertain. There had been a discovery near the Gare du Nord, a body. Not unusual, not at first, a tramp perhaps, or some drunken brawl turned final. But the sergeant's words faltered, and that was what caught Maigret's ear. The details were scant. A man found slumped against the wall of a narrow passage by the station, as though resting, with nothing remarkable but for the umbrella at his side. The sergeant, embarrassed by his own insistence, explained the umbrella was dry, bone dry, on a day when nothing, not coats, not hats, not even dogs, had been spared the drizzle. Maigret stood still with the receiver in his hand, eyes half closed, letting the words settle. A dead man was common enough in Paris, but a dry umbrella beside a body soaked by the weather, that was less ordinary. He replaced the receiver gently, nodded once to the proprietor and settled his hat on his head. Outside, the air struck him like a damp cloth. He turned up his collar, pipe clenched in his teeth, and began the short walk back across the bridges toward the north of the city. The streets glistened, the Seine carried a dull metallic sheen, and Maigret felt that familiar shift within him, the slow turning of gears, the readiness to step out of himself and into the quiet patience of inquiry. It wasn't yet urgency. It never was with him. It was simply that something in the city had tilted, some small wrongness waiting to be explained. And he, more than anyone else, could not ignore it. The drizzle had thickened into a soft rain by the time Maigret reached the narrow streets that threaded around the Gare du Nord. The pavements were crowded despite the weather. Porters pushing carts, travellers with wet collars, women clutching packages to their chests as they hurried home. Maigret moved at his steady pace, solid and deliberate, his heavy frame undisturbed by the bustle around him. He was not in a hurry. He rarely was. It was not speed that brought him to the truth, but the slow gathering of impressions, the way a damp wall absorbs moisture until it can hold no more. At the entrance of the passage described by the sergeant, two uniformed men stood uncertainly, their boots planted wide, hands awkwardly clasped behind their backs. They straightened when they saw him, but Maigret merely raised a hand in greeting, as if reminding them he was no general here to inspect them, but another man arriving to look at something curious. The sergeant, thin-faced, barely more than a boy, guided him in. The passage was dim, smelling of stale urine and damp plaster. Against the far wall slumped the body, a man in his 50s perhaps, grey hair thinning, a coat too light for the season. His head rested against the stone, tilted slightly as though he had stopped to catch his breath and never moved again. The rain had matted his hair, left his trousers dark with moisture. And at his side, neatly upright, the umbrella. It was black, of decent quality, and though the ground about it glistened with water, its fabric shone untouched, dry as though it had just been lifted from a shop counter. Maigret lowered himself slowly, his knees protesting, and peered closer. The man's shoes were muddy at the tips, but dry on the insteps. His right hand hung limp at his side, palm outward, while the left was folded across his lap. The sergeant shifted beside him. "We thought, sir. Perhaps he sat here before the rain began. But—" He gestured helplessly at the umbrella. Maigret nodded. He didn't answer. He didn't need to yet. Instead, he reached into his coat for his pipe, tamped it gently, and struck a match. The flame glowed, reflected in the wet stones, then died as he drew smoke into his lungs. He exhaled slowly, eyes half closed. The silence stretched until the young man fidgeted. "Did anyone see him arrive?" Maigret asked finally, his voice low even. "Not that we know. A railway porter noticed him when he passed through with a cart. Said the man seemed asleep, but when he came back a few minutes later, he was still in the same position. He called us." Maigret stood, brushing dampness from his hands. He moved to the mouth of the passage and looked out toward the street. Rain streaked past the dim lamps, making every face hurried, blurred. He could feel the rhythm of the place, the perpetual arrivals and departures, the anonymity that wrapped itself around a railway station like a fog, a good place to vanish, or to appear. He returned to the body, crouched once more, and touched the man's wrist gently. Cold, though not icy, the rain had washed away surface traces, leaving only the impression of a man caught at the wrong moment, in the wrong place. His pockets yielded little. A handkerchief, 2 metro tickets, a few francs, and a worn leather wallet containing nothing but a folded scrap of paper with a telephone number scrawled in ink. No identity card. Maigret slipped the paper back without comment. His eyes lingered again on the umbrella. He lifted it carefully, feeling its weight. Outside, Paris pressed on with its routines, trams clattering, cafes spilling laughter, couples huddling under dripping awnings. Within his office, Maigret filled his pipe again, leaned back, and allowed the image to deepen. He could see the station's restless crowd, the anonymous faces sliding past each other, and among them, though he could not yet name them, the face of the one who had wished to tidy the scene with a dry umbrella. He would not chase them. Not yet, he would wait. Someone, somewhere, would betray themselves. They always did if you gave them time. Maigret did not leave the office that night. He remained seated long after the building had grown quiet. The last typewriters silenced. The corridors emptied of footsteps. Rain drummed steadily against the windows, softening the sounds of the city, as though Paris itself were muffled under a thick blanket. He smoked pipe after pipe, letting the blue haze settle around him, while the dry umbrella refused to leave his mind. It was not evidence yet, not even a clue in the strict sense. It was a gesture, small, precise, and deliberate. Whoever had left it had wanted to change the story of the man slumped in the passage. To cover him, or perhaps to decorate him like a flower placed on a grave. He rose at last, heavy with fatigue, and went home. Madame Maigret was waiting, the lamp low, the supper reheated without complaint. She did not ask questions. She rarely did. They ate in silence, the quiet between them filled with the long familiarity of a couple who no longer needed words. Before bed, as she folded her knitting, she said only, "Don't catch cold." He grunted in reply, though her words lingered with a curious weight, as if she too sensed the damp had carried more than rain into his coat. In the morning, Paris awoke under a sky the color of dirty wool. The rain had stopped but left the air heavy, the streets slick with puddles. Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres before most of his men, his broad shoulders hunched, as though bearing the city's dampness with him. The file on the dead man lay on his desk, thin as expected. No identification yet, no family come forward. The doctor's report, preliminary and perfunctory, noted heart failure as a possibility, though it was impossible to be certain without further examination. Nothing in the man's pockets suggested violence. No bruises, no wounds, and yet the umbrella remained. Janvier entered with his usual briskness, setting down a cup of coffee. The number in the wallet, local exchange. We traced it to a boarding house on Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis. The landlady says she doesn't know the man. Maigret sipped the bitter coffee, eyes narrowing slightly, and yet the number was his only paper. She was flustered when we asked, said perhaps a former lodger wrote it down by mistake. We can go again. Maigret shook his head. I'll go. His tone was mild, but Janvier understood. There was no rush of policemen here, no need for pressure. What was required was presence. By mid-morning, Maigret found himself walking the length of the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis. The neighborhood smelled of cabbage soup and coal smoke, the life of small trades and weary tenants. At number 112, a narrow door stood between a tobacco shop and a dingy bakery. Inside, the boarding house staircase rose steep and worn, smelling faintly of boiled linen and stale air. The landlady was a small woman in her 60s, hair pinned tightly, apron stiff with starch. She greeted him with cautious courtesy, eyes flickering toward the buttons on his coat that marked his office. When he mentioned the telephone number, her hands trembled slightly as she wiped them on her apron. Yes, Inspector, it is our number. But I don't know that man. I've never seen him. Her denial came too quickly, too firmly, the words spilling out before he had even finished his question. Maigret's gaze rested on her face without speaking. He had learned long ago that silence was more revealing than interrogation. She shifted under his eyes, glanced toward the narrow corridor behind her, then back. We have many tenants. Some stay a week, some a night. Perhaps he visited once. How should I know? Still Maigret said nothing. He lit his pipe, filling the hallway with smoke, his expression calm, almost weary. The woman grew restless, twisting her apron strings until at last she added, "Would you like to see the register?" He nodded once. She produced a large stained ledger from behind the desk and opened it with care. Names filled the pages, neat at the start of each month, then scrawled and hurried. Maigret leaned close, scanning without comment. Near the end of last week appeared the entry René Vasseur, with no address provided, only a note, paid in advance. The handwriting was shaky, uncertain. Unlike the neat script of the other entries, Maigret tapped the page gently with a thick finger. "Who wrote this?" The landlady hesitated, then muttered, "It looks like his own hand. Sometimes lodgers fill it in themselves." Maigret's eyes lingered on the name. It could be real, or it could be nothing more than a borrowed alias. But it was a beginning. He closed the ledger, handed it back, and asked in his low voice, "Which room?" She flushed, hesitated, then led him upstairs. The third floor smelled strongly of damp plaster. Room 12 was small, scarcely more than a bed, a washstand, and a narrow wardrobe. The bed had been slept in, but not recently. The sheets smelled stale. On the washstand stood a shaving mug with dried lather, and in the wardrobe hung a single suit, worn but respectable, and a shirt collar yellowed with use. Maigret opened the drawer of the washstand. Inside lay a cheap fountain pen and a folded sheet of paper. He lifted it carefully. A letter unfinished, written in the same shaky hand. The words were few. "Je n'ai pas le courage." The rest of the sentence trailed off into scratches. "I do not have the courage." He replaced the paper quietly, as though not to disturb it, then turned to the landlady. Her eyes darted away, her lips pressed thin. "You never saw him?" he asked softly. She did not answer. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, Maigret sat once more at his desk, the faint trace of the letter still in his mind. The man had written of lacking courage. To what? To live? To confess? To resist? The umbrella, the missing identity, the empty room, all spoke not of chance but of arrangement. Someone had wished to paint a picture, yet the brushstrokes were clumsy. He sent Janvier to discreetly question the other tenants of the boarding house. He instructed Lucas to search for any record of a René Vasseur in the city. Then, leaning back, he allowed his eyes to close. In the dark behind his lids he saw again the passage by the Gare du Nord, the body seated like a traveller waiting for a train that would never arrive. He saw the umbrella dry defiant beside him, and he thought of the unfinished line, "Je n'ai pas le courage." The truth was not yet visible, but it was circling just beyond reach like a shadow moving behind frosted glass. It would come, he knew. If he remained still enough, if he watched and waited. It would step into the light of its own accord. By the afternoon, the rhythm of the Quai des Orfèvres had returned to its usual quiet bustle. The scrape of chairs, the shuffle of papers, the occasional telephone ringing, and he returned the glass and remarked softly, almost idly, "It must be difficult to manage alone. So many rooms, so many strangers." Her lips pressed thin. "One does what one can, Inspector." He did not move, only regarded her with the steady weight of his gaze. At last she shifted, her voice low, almost pleading. "I told you the truth. I did not know him. He stayed a night no more." Maigret filled his pipe again, struck a match, and spoke through the smoke. "Yet he wrote your number on a slip of paper. He had no other address, no other name. He left behind a sentence unfinished. I do not have the courage." Her hands clenched at her sides. "People come here with all sorts of troubles. It is not my concern." Maigret let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating. She turned away, busying herself with an invisible task, but her shoulders sagged. He did not press her, not yet. He left with a polite nod, stepping once more into the fading light. That evening, back in his office, the umbrella lay across his desk. He had requested it be brought from evidence, and now it rested there, its fabric taut and unblemished. He traced the handle with his thick fingers. It was not cheap, not extravagant either. A clerk might own such a thing, or a small shopkeeper, but not a man who rented a single room and left behind only a worn suit and unfinished letter. It belonged elsewhere to someone else. The thought carried him to a small café near the station, the kind where porters drank their wine after long shifts. He sat in the corner, pipe unlit, and listened. Two men at the next table spoke of the body found in the passage, their voices low but animated. One claimed the man had looked too tidy to be a tramp. The other scoffed, insisting death made all men look alike. Maigret absorbed their chatter, letting the tone sink in more than the words. People had noticed. People always did, even when they pretended otherwise. He left without comment, returning home at last. Madame Maigret had prepared stew, and the warmth of their dining room pressed gently against the damp unease of his day. She asked nothing until they had finished eating. Then, while clearing the plates, she remarked in her quiet, practical way, "It is strange, isn't it, to have an umbrella and yet not use it? I always say an umbrella means you are prepared, but perhaps he was not the kind of man who was." Maigret looked at her across the cleared table, his eyes thoughtful. "Or perhaps," he murmured, "it was never his umbrella." The next morning he returned to the station and summoned Janvier. Together they visited the shops near the Gare du Nord, one by one. They carried the umbrella, showing it to shopkeepers. Most shook their heads, uninterested. But at a small tobacconist's, the woman behind the counter paused, squinted, and nodded. "That belonged to Monsieur Joris. He comes here often, smokes Gauloise. A dry fellow, always careful with his things." Maigret's eyes narrowed slightly. "Joris?" She shrugged. "He has a room not far from here. Works as a clerk, I think. Tall, thin, with spectacles. Always carrying that umbrella, no matter the weather." When they left the shop, Janvier's expression was puzzled. Then why was it beside the dead man? Maigret did not answer. He walked slowly, each step deliberate. His gaze fixed ahead as though the drizzle returning to the air had written something only he could read. The umbrella was a thread, thin but real, leading away from the anonymous corpse toward another life, another set of choices. Whoever had placed it there had not done so carelessly. It was the beginning of a story still hidden, and Maigret, with his patience and his silence, would wait until the story chose to reveal itself. That night, as the rain thickened once more, he sat in his office, pipe smoke clouding the lamplight, and thought not of evidence but of people, of the landlady with her trembling hands, of the unfinished letter on cheap paper, of the tobacconist certain of her customer, Monsieur Joris. The circle was small, too small to remain unbroken for long. Someone would falter, someone would speak, and Maigret would be there as always to listen. The name Joris clung to Maigret's thoughts the way smoke clings to a heavy coat. It was not remarkable in itself. Paris contained many Jorises, but joined with the tobacconist's certainty and the umbrella that had been so neatly abandoned beside a corpse, it became more than a name. Maigret did not hurry. He seldom did. Instead, he asked Janvier to inquire quietly, to visit the cafés near the station, to ask clerks who worked in the area, to let the name circulate as if in passing. Paris was full of people who claimed to know little, yet could not resist offering fragments, and fragments, when allowed to settle, often formed a shape. By early evening, a sketch had emerged. Monsieur Joris, a Belgian by birth, lived in a small furnished room on Rue de Dunkerque within easy reach of the station. He was in his late 30s, tall and thin with spectacles that often slid down his nose. He worked in the accounting office of a shipping firm, earning modest wages but known to be punctual, cautious, meticulous. He was not disliked, but neither was he close to anyone. Colleagues described him as dry, reserved, a man who observed more than he spoke, and always, they said, he carried his umbrella. Maigret listened to Janvier's report while tamping his pipe, nodding faintly. He let the silence stretch, as though waiting to see if the name itself would offer further resistance. Then he rose heavily from his chair, pulling on his overcoat, and said only, "We will go and see." The Rue de Dunkerque was dim and narrow, lined with houses that leaned slightly toward each other, their windows streaked with soot. The rain had returned in thin threads, clinging to the gas lamps and making the cobblestones gleam. Maigret's shoes struck a steady rhythm as he mounted the stairs of number 48, Janvier close behind. The concierge, a stout woman with sharp eyes, admitted them reluctantly. "Ah, Monsieur Joris," she said, her tone grudging. "Quiet as a mouse. Pays his rent on time. Never trouble from him." Maigret nodded, the familiar weight of his silence pressing her until she added, "He hasn't been home since yesterday morning. Strange for him. He's always regular." Back by 7, supper in his room, lights out by 10. They climbed to the second floor. Joris's room was small, the air close with the smell of old tobacco and ink. A desk stood against the wall, neat to the point of austerity. Ledgers were stacked carefully, papers aligned. The bed was made with hospital precision. On a chair lay a pair of trousers neatly folded, beside them a clean shirt and collar. Everything suggested order, discipline, a man who left nothing untidy, and yet the umbrella was missing. Maigret stood in the center of the room, pipe in hand, while Janvier searched quietly. The wardrobe yielded 2 more suits, worn but brushed. The desk drawers contained ink bottles, correspondence, receipts from the shipping firm. No photograph, no personal memento, nothing that hinted at family or friendship. Only papers, all in the same careful hand. On the mantel above the narrow fireplace stood a half-empty tin of Gauloise. Janvier spoke at last. "It seems he has vanished, Chief." Maigret said nothing. He lowered himself heavily into the desk chair, his broad hands resting flat on the neat stack of papers. He inhaled the smell of the room, stale smoke, ink, a faint trace of polish. Then he asked, "Did anyone see him leave?" The concierge confirmed later that she had seen Joris leave the previous morning with his umbrella, as always. She had not seen him return. That was the day the body had been found in the passage by the station. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, the pieces arranged themselves not into clarity, but into a thicker kind of fog. The dead man, unnamed but calling himself René Vasseur, had no belongings save a worn suit and an unfinished letter. Joris, meticulous clerk, had disappeared, leaving behind a tidy room and no umbrella. And between them, the umbrella itself, dry, deliberate, placed beside the corpse as if to transfer ownership. Maigret did not try to force the connection. He filled his pipe and waited, days before. He stood in the damp silence, his coat collar turned up, watching the flow of travelers hurrying past. It was a place where anonymity ruled, where one face replaced another endlessly. A man could meet another here unnoticed. A man could sit down and never rise again. The porter appeared again, as if drawn by curiosity, and Maigret spoke to him once more. This time he asked a different question. "Did you see anyone else nearby besides the dead man?" The porter frowned, thought carefully. "Now that you ask..." A tall fellow passed just before I saw him. Thin, with spectacles. I remember because he carried no umbrella, and that seemed odd in the rain. Maigret exhaled smoke into the damp air. The image settled quietly. Joris, tall and thin, spectacles sliding down his nose, walking past the passage without his umbrella. And beside the body, the umbrella itself, untouched by rain. He returned to headquarters, the drizzle clinging to him like a second skin. In his office he stood at the window, watching the Seine flow sluggish and grey. The investigation had not advanced by leaps but by quiet steps, each one small, ordinary, human. A missing clerk, an anonymous corpse, an umbrella that spoke more than words. He did not yet know the story, but he felt it pressing closer, like a fog about to lift. The connections were not forged in logic alone, but in the weight of silence, in the tremor of a landlady's hands, in the unease of a clerk who spoke too late. The truth was not far. It was circling, timid, waiting for the moment to reveal itself, and Maigret, as always, would wait. The next morning dawned colder, the air biting as though the rain had stripped the city of its last warmth. Maigret rose earlier than usual, drinking his coffee in silence while Madame Maigret watched him with her quiet, knowing eyes. She did not ask about the case. She rarely did, but she noticed the heaviness in his posture, the way he sat hunched as if bearing not just the damp chill, but the weight of something still unformed. He left without finishing his second cup, pulling his coat tightly around him, as he stepped into the misty street. At the Quai des Orfèvres, the umbrella still lay on his desk. He had left it there deliberately, a silent companion to his thoughts. Its dry folds seemed to mock the wet streets outside. He touched the handle again, as if it might whisper its story, and found himself staring at the faint scratches in the wood. They were not random. Someone had handled it often, worried it between their fingers while waiting, perhaps while thinking. Joris's umbrella, without doubt, but why should it be found beside another man? Janvier arrived with news. No one had yet come forward to claim the body. No relatives, no acquaintances. The name René Vasseur yielded nothing in the records beyond a handful of men, too old or too young to match. The dead man remained anonymous, his only connection to the world a slip of paper with the boarding house number and the umbrella that was not his. Lucas brought another fragment. He had spoken with clerks at the shipping firm where Joris worked. They said there had indeed been trouble in the accounts, a discrepancy, not vast but noticeable, that had been troubling the management. Nothing official had been said, but there were whispers that someone had made errors or worse, had shifted funds. Joris, meticulous Joris, had seemed drawn into the matter, staying late, poring over the books. He had looked pale, thinner even, as if drained by something too heavy to carry. Maigret listened without comment, smoking slowly, the smoke wreathing his broad face in shadows. He did not dismiss the reports nor seize on them. Instead, he asked for the ledgers to be collected quietly, not for accountants to analyze, but for himself to leaf through, absorbing their smell, their feel, their small human notations. He had learned that numbers too could bear the imprint of their author's unease. By midday he walked once more to the Rue de Dunkerque. The concierge eyed him warily, but he said nothing, merely climbed the stairs to Joris's room. It remained as they had left it, neat, cold, too tidy. He sat in the chair again, pipe in hand, and let his eyes wander over the objects. The trousers folded with care, the shirt and collar ready for the next day. The desk too orderly, as if arranged for someone else's inspection. Only one thing seemed out of place, the half-empty tin of Gauloises. He lifted it, shook it gently, and listened to the faint rattle of cigarettes within. Joris had been a man of routine. Would he leave his cigarettes half full? Or had he left them for someone else to find, a small token, a trace? The concierge, pressed again, admitted reluctantly that Joris had received a visitor 2 nights before his disappearance. A man, older, with thinning grey hair, who had stayed less than half an hour. She had thought little of it then, but now she could not be certain. When Maigret asked if she could recognize him, she shook her head, her memory clouded by doubt. Yet her description lingered, for it matched faintly the body found in the passage. Back at headquarters, Maigret sat with this thought heavy in him. The dead man might have been Joris's visitor. They had met again, perhaps near the station, where anonymity ruled. Something had passed between them, money, words, guilt. One had ended slumped against the wall, the other had vanished, leaving his umbrella to guard the scene. Evening fell before the first real crack appeared. Air call came from a small restaurant near the Gare de l'Est. The owner, nervous and apologetic, said a man answering Joris's description had eaten there the night before the body was discovered. He had been alone, drinking more than usual, staring at nothing. At one point he had muttered aloud, "It is finished, it is all finished," before paying abruptly and leaving. Maigret thanked the man, replaced the receiver, and sat a long while in silence. He could almost see Joris now, thin shoulders hunched, spectacles slipping, murmuring to himself as though rehearsing an ending. Not the ending of another man, perhaps, but of himself. Yet the corpse belonged to someone else. He walked again to the station, Janvier at his side. The drizzle had ceased, but the street still shone as though slicked with oil. They passed through the crowd, slow and deliberate, until they stood once more in the narrow passage. The wall still bore faint traces where the man's head had rested. Travelers hurried past, indifferent. Maigret smoked in silence, watching the flow of people. He asked Janvier to imagine the scene, Joris, the anonymous man, the umbrella. What had happened? A quarrel? A confession? Or had the dead man simply collapsed, leaving Joris with a choice, to fetch help or to vanish? Janvier suggested robbery, but Maigret shook his head. No money had been taken, no watch, no chain. This was not greed. It was something quieter, heavier. Back in his office, the ledger lay waiting. Maigret opened it slowly, page by page. The figures lined up neatly, yet there were corrections, tiny adjustments in the margins. Not many, but enough to suggest a hand trying to disguise its error. He traced the ink with his finger, imagining Joris bent over the desk night after night, wrestling with sums that refused to balance. Perhaps the grey-haired visitor had been linked to those sums, another clerk, a former associate, someone whose presence reminded Joris of a truth he could not bear. The night deepened. The building grew quiet. Maigret remained at his desk, the umbrella before him like a stubborn witness. He thought of Joris's room, too tidy, waiting as if for an inspection. He thought of the landlady, her trembling hands, her half-truths. He thought of the anonymous man, slumped against the wall as though resting, while the umbrella stood beside him like a sentry. The pieces did not yet fit, but they circled. Maigret gestured for him to sit, though Lognon hovered awkwardly on the edge of the chair, as though it might collapse beneath him. He spoke of a patrolman who had seen Joris several nights earlier, standing outside a café not far from the station, speaking with an older man. The description matched the dead man. The conversation had been short, tense, and ended with Joris turning away sharply. The older man had looked defeated, sagging into himself before disappearing into the crowd. The patrolman had thought little of it until the body was found. Maigret nodded, puffing slowly on his pipe. The fragment fitted neatly beside the concierge's hesitant admission. The dead man had been Joris's visitor. Their connection was no longer in doubt. What remained hidden was the nature of it. What words had passed between them? What burden had pressed them both until one vanished and the other collapsed? When Lognon left, trailing his habitual air of dissatisfaction, Maigret summoned Janvier and instructed him to search for traces of the dead man, pension records, employment files, anything that might give him back his name. He asked Lucas to dig deeper into the shipping firm's accounts, not with an auditor's eye but with a policeman's patience. He himself remained at the desk, staring at the umbrella as if it might shift and confess its purpose. By afternoon, a small crack appeared. Janvier returned with a file pulled from the archives. A man named Armand Rouel, 56 years old, once employed as a bookkeeper for a textile company that had gone bankrupt 2 years earlier. Rouel had no fixed address in recent months, drifting from one lodging to another, surviving on odd jobs and the remnants of a modest pension. The description matched. The fingerprints taken from the body confirmed it. The anonymous corpse now had a name. Maigret sat back, exhaling smoke in a long stream. Rouel and Joris, both clerks, both men of ledgers and columns, of sums that balanced or failed to balance. Perhaps they had known each other before. Perhaps Rouel had reappeared in Joris's life with a demand, a reminder, a threat. Something had bound them, at least for those last days. He sent Janvier back to the Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis with Rouel's photograph to show the landlady. She recognized him at once as the visitor she had pretended not to know. Her face, Janvier reported, had gone pale as flour when she saw the image. Though she admitted nothing further, that evening, as the fog thickened again over the river, Maigret walked alone through the streets near the Gare du Nord. He did not question anyone. He merely observed the restless tide of travelers, the men smoking outside cafes, the women carrying baskets, the endless rhythm of arrivals and departures. It was a place where men like Joris and Rouel could cross paths unnoticed, where one could vanish as easily as a drop of rain in the gutter. He stopped at the passage where the body had been found. The stone wall was still damp. the air still faintly rank. He stood with his hands in his pockets, pipe smoke drifting upward, and imagined the scene again. Joris with his umbrella, Ruel with his thinning hair, the two of them pausing in the drizzle. Perhaps they had argued. Perhaps they had spoken too softly for anyone to notice. Perhaps Ruel had simply faltered, his heart giving way under the weight of words too heavy to carry, and Joris, standing above him, had placed his umbrella at the corpse's side. An act not of malice, perhaps, but of confusion, of desperation. A gesture that changed nothing yet altered everything. Back at home that night, Madame Maigret remarked while setting down the soup, "You look more tired than usual." He smiled faintly, though the heaviness did not lift. After the meal, while she cleared the table, she added, "It's strange, isn't it, how some people disappear so easily, as if they were never really here." He thought of Ruel, faceless until this morning, and of Joris, whose tidy room seemed more like a stage set than a home. He thought of the umbrella standing dry while the city drowned in rain. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said at last. "Strange." The next morning, the reports on the shipping firm's ledgers arrived. Lucas spread them across the desk, muttering about irregularities. Sums missing, shifted between accounts, names erased or rewritten. Nothing massive, but enough to sink a small man with a conscience. Joris had been at the center of it. Whether as culprit or discoverer was not yet clear. And Ruel, once a bookkeeper himself, might have been drawn in, perhaps as an accomplice, perhaps as a witness who knew too much. Maigret smoked heavily as he considered the papers. He did not see numbers. He saw men bent over ledgers late at night, their eyes strained, their hands shaking, their lives narrowing to columns of figures until they collapsed under the weight of them. Ruel had collapsed literally. Joris had vanished. The umbrella remained, silent, refusing to explain itself. He leaned back, pipe smoke thick in the air, and let the silence gather. The truth was not yet ready to show itself, but he felt it pressing closer. Joris could not stay hidden forever. He was not a man built for flight, not a man who could lose himself in the crowd for long. He was a creature of routine, of order. He would surface again, if only because disorder frightened him more than discovery. And when he did, Maigret would be waiting, as patient and immovable as the fog over Paris. The following day the fog lingered, though thinner, drifting like pale smoke above the Seine. Maigret arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres later than usual, his face heavy with fatigue from a night of poor sleep. He had dreamed of ledgers and umbrellas, of figures that refused to balance no matter how often he added them, and of faceless men waiting in damp passages. He shook it off with his first pipe, standing at the window of his office while the city stirred below. Janvier came in briskly with an update. A witness had surfaced. The waiter from the small restaurant near the Gare de l'Est had recalled that Joris had not been alone that night. He had noticed a man, older, grey-haired, join him briefly at the table before leaving abruptly. The waiter had assumed they were acquaintances, perhaps workmates, but the mood between them had been strained. The description fit Ruel. The waiter's memory placed the meeting less than 24 hours before Ruel was found dead. Maigret listened in silence, tamping his pipe. He did not ask questions. He let the details hang in the air until they settled into their place. He pictured Joris, shoulders hunched, spectacles sliding, murmuring that it was finished, all finished, while Ruel slipped away into the rain. The scene grew clearer, though the meaning remained veiled. Lucas arrived with his own findings. Ruel had once been employed by a textile company that collapsed under debts and accusations of fraud. Though never charged, whispers had followed him. Some suspected he had altered the accounts before the firm's ruin. Others believed he had merely been careless. In either case, his career had ended in disgrace. He had drifted since, surviving on scraps until he found his way to Paris again. If he and Joris had crossed paths, it was not by chance. Both men belonged to the world of columns and sums, of lives reduced to neat entries that nevertheless hid messy truths. Maigret sat back, smoke wreathing around him. He asked quietly, was there overlap between Ruel's firm and Joris's shipping company? Lucas admitted none was obvious. Yet both handled accounts for trade. At the far end of a smoky cafe, hunched over a glass of beer gone flat, sat a tall, thin man with spectacles. The collar of his coat was frayed, his hair unkempt, his hands trembling faintly as he lifted the glass. It was Joris. He looked less like a fugitive than a man dissolving into the fog, worn down by solitude and sleeplessness. Maigret did not approach at once. He ordered a beer, sat near the door and smoked. Joris did not notice him. He stared into the glass as though it might offer an answer. When at last he rose to leave, Maigret followed at a distance, heavy footsteps steady behind him. Joris walked slowly, shoulders slumped, heading toward the darkened streets near the station. The drizzle began again, thin needles pricking the pavement. At the corner of the passage where Ruel had been found, Joris stopped. He stood very still, staring at the damp wall, his hands deep in his pockets. Maigret approached, not quickly, but with the same inevitability as the rain. When he reached Joris's side, he lit his pipe, the flare of the match casting both their faces briefly into light. "You left your umbrella," Maigret said softly. Joris flinched, his spectacles catching the lamplight. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. His throat worked, his eyes darted to the wall, to the stone still stained by the memory of Ruel's body. Then his shoulders sagged, and he whispered, almost inaudibly, "I didn't know what else to do." The fog thickened around them, swallowing the street, leaving only the two men, the faint hiss of rain, and the unspoken weight of guilt pressing between them. The words left Joris's lips like air escaping from a punctured lung, fragile and trembling. He did not move away from the wall. He kept staring at it, as though the damp stones themselves might accuse him. Maigret remained beside him, pipe glowing faintly in the mist, the silence between them filling the narrow passage more than words ever could. He did not ask a question, not yet. He let the moment breathe, the drizzle tracing thin lines across their coats, the muffled city sounds beyond the passage reminding them of life continuing elsewhere. Joris's hands emerged from his pockets, pale and restless, fingers opening and closing as if testing their strength. Finally, in a voice scarcely above a whisper, he said, "He found me. After all these years, he found me." His breath came in uneven bursts. "I thought it was over, buried. I tried to live quietly, to disappear. But he came back and I couldn't—" His words faltered, leaving the sentence unfinished. Maigret took the pipe from his mouth, exhaled slowly, and asked in a tone as gentle as it was firm, "Ruel?" Joris nodded once, almost imperceptibly. His shoulders seemed to sink further under the weight of the name. "He ruined everything before. The company, the accounts, the men who worked there. I was young then, learning. I didn't know enough to stop him. When the collapse came, I walked away. No one accused me. I kept my silence, but I carried it with me. Every column of numbers since then, every balance checked and rechecked, it was him I saw, his shadow at the edge of the page. And now he returned, needing money, needing a witness to say he was not at fault. He wanted me to give him back the respectability he had lost." His voice cracked, and he pressed his hand to his mouth. "I couldn't bear it, Inspector. I couldn't go through it again. I told him no. I told him it was finished. He begged me, then cursed me. I left him. Later I found him here. I don't know if he followed me or if it was chance. He was seated like that, slumped head against the wall. I thought he was waiting still, but he was gone. The drizzle turned heavier, dripping from the brim of Maigret's hat. He studied Joris's drawn face, the spectacles fogged, the trembling lips. "And the umbrella?" he asked softly. Joris looked at him then, eyes wide like a child caught in a lie. "It was mine. I didn't know. It felt wrong, leaving him like that, alone in the rain. He had nothing. He looked so pitiful. I thought, if I left it, people would think he had been prepared, that he had some dignity still. It was foolish. Foolish, I know. But I couldn't stand to walk away with it dry while he sat soaked beside the wall." He broke off, his breath ragged. Maigret did not answer immediately. He replaced the pipe between his teeth, puffed once, twice, letting the silence absorb Joris's confession. It was not guilt of murder that weighed on him, but the heavier guilt of weakness, of choices made long ago and choices evaded now. "Why did you hide?" Maigret asked finally. Joris's shoulders hunched. "Because I thought you would not believe me. Because I was ashamed. Because once, years ago, I did nothing, and men lost their livelihoods. And when he came back, I did nothing again. I only wanted to vanish. Perhaps I deserved to vanish." They stood in silence again, the rain pattering softly around them. For a moment it seemed as though Joris might collapse in the same posture as Ruel, surrendering to exhaustion. Maigret placed a heavy hand on his arm, not gripping, simply resting there with the weight of inevitability. "Come," he said. They walked together through the misting streets, Joris silent, Maigret steady beside him. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Janvier looked up in surprise as they entered, but Maigret offered no explanation, only directed him with a glance to prepare a statement. Joris sat at the desk, spectacles slipping, hands trembling as he signed his name again and again at the bottom of the pages. Each stroke of the pen seemed to drain him further, as though the act of confessing, not to a crime, but to his own weakness, were more punishing than any accusation could be. When it was finished, Maigret dismissed the others and remained alone with him. The office was quiet, the umbrella lying on the desk like a mute witness. Joris's eyes fixed on it with a kind of despair. "It was never meant to be like this," he murmured. Maigret filled his pipe once more, the rasp of the match striking loud in the silence. He regarded Joris with a weary compassion, the kind reserved for men who are not villains but merely frail. "It rarely is," he said. "Men don't plan for collapse. They drift toward it. And when it comes, they're too tired to resist." Joris's shoulders trembled. He did not weep, not fully, but his breath shook in his chest. Maigret let him sit like that, not pressing further. He knew the truth of the case was already there. Ruel, disgraced and desperate, had sought out Joris, demanding he erase the stain of his past. Joris, timid and fastidious, had refused, and Ruel's heart had given out under the strain. Joris, left with a corpse and his own cowardice, had tried to arrange a small dignity with the umbrella, a gesture that betrayed him instead. There was no murder to solve, no villain to unmask, only the weary tragedy of ordinary men undone by numbers, pride and fear. As dawn approached, Maigret released Joris into the custody of the examining magistrate. It would not be a trial for homicide, but there would be hearings, questions, the public record of a man's collapse. Joris went without resistance, his thin figure swallowed by the fog outside. When the building was quiet again, Maigret remained in his office, pipe smoke thickening around him. He stared at the umbrella, now returned to its owner and stripped of its mystery. It was, after all, only an umbrella, and yet it had told the whole story. Not of crime in the ordinary sense, but of frailty, of the human need to cover what cannot be endured. Outside, the fog lifted slowly, revealing the damp streets, the flow of ordinary life resuming as though nothing had happened. Maigret sat heavy in his chair, watching, listening, his thoughts not on guilt or innocence, but on the quiet inevitability of men. Breaking under their own silence, the city was beginning to shrug off its blanket of fog when Maigret finally stepped out of the Quai des Orfèvres. The air was sharp, almost cleansing after the stale smoke of his office, and the river flowed sluggishly beneath the pale morning light. He walked slowly, his hands sunk deep in the pockets of his heavy overcoat, his mind not on the magistrate who would soon question Joris, nor on the clerks who would file papers and prepare reports, but on the quiet, unremarkable figure of a man undone not by malice but by fear. Cases like this never ended with the satisfaction of triumph, only with a dull ache of recognition. He thought of Madame Maigret waiting at home, of the warmth of her kitchen, of her way of reminding him without words that the world contained small certainties, even when men themselves did not. By mid-morning, he returned to headquarters. Janvier and Lucas were already at their desks, writing reports with dutiful neatness. They greeted him cautiously, as though uncertain whether the case was closed. The day stretched quietly. Rain threatened but did not fall, the sky heavy with it. Visitors came and went, a clerk from the shipping firm, pale and nervous, repeating that Joris had been a model worker. The landlady from Rue du Faubourg Saint-Denis, summoned again, now more defiant than afraid, insisting she had nothing more to add. Maigret received them all with the same calm presence, letting them speak into the silence until their words collapsed into repetition. Nothing new emerged. The story remained what it was. Ruel disgraced and desperate, pressing Joris for help. Joris refusing, then watching him die without lifting a hand. The umbrella left like a gesture of penance. Late in the afternoon, when the offices had quieted, Madame Maigret arrived. She had brought him a scarf, saying only that the weather was turning, and he would catch a cold if he did not take care. She did not linger, only touched his arm lightly before leaving. He watched her go with a heaviness that was not sorrow but something quieter, a reminder of how rare it was to meet a life lived without deception. When evening came, he returned once more to the streets around the Gare du Nord. He had no need to be there, yet he felt the case had not quite released him. The passage where Ruel had died was dark now, the lamps weak, the stones damp from the mist. He stood in it alone, filling the space with pipe smoke, listening to the distant hum of trains. He imagined Ruel slumped there again, imagined Joris standing over him with the umbrella in his hand, torn between shame and pity. Nothing about it resembled the crimes his superiors wanted solved, the neat arrests, the tidy trials. This was something else, something smaller and sadder, born not of evil but of frailty. A porter passed and recognized him, raising his cap. He hesitated, then said, "Funny thing, Chief, the way he sat there. Looked like he was waiting for a train that never came." Maigret nodded slowly, the image lodging deeper. He did not correct the man, did not explain that the train had been life itself, missed long before Ruel ever set foot in that passage. Instead, he walked away, heavy and deliberate, the drizzle beginning again against his hat brim. Back at the Quai des Orfèvres, he found Lucas waiting, file in hand. The magistrate had pressed for confirmation. There was no sign of violence, no evidence of theft. Officially, the case would close as natural death. But the file would carry Joris's name too, his statement attached, his frailty recorded for bureaucratic posterity. Maigret signed where needed, the pen scratching across paper, his hand as steady as ever, though his mind was far away. The night deepened. The building emptied. Alone in his office, he poured himself a small glass of brandy from the bottle he kept hidden in the drawer. He sipped it slowly, his pipe resting cold beside him, the silence settling around him like a cloak. The umbrella no longer concerned him. Its mystery had dissolved. What remained was the image of two men, one slumped against a wall, worn out by disgrace, the other standing over him, incapable of action, leaving only a small gesture to cover his own helplessness. Maigret knew he would remember them, not because they were criminals or victims, but because they were ordinary. Ordinary men, lost in the tide of the city, undone not by grand passions but by the slow erosion of pride and fear. That was the heart of his work, though no one in the newspapers cared to write about it. Not triumph, not revelation, but the weary knowledge that people break quietly, and that someone must stand among the fragments, listening, waiting, bearing witness. He finished the brandy, put out the lamp and rose. Outside the rain had begun in earnest, washing the streets clean, though never for long. He walked into it with his collar turned up, his broad frame steady, his hat brim dripping. Paris breathed around him, its cafés glowing, its streets murmuring, its river swollen with secrets, and he breathed with it, weary, compassionate, and unhurried. The case of the body beside the dry umbrella, already folding into the endless fabric of human frailty, he carried within him. And as he made his way home, he thought not of arrests or verdicts, but of the quiet figure who would be waiting in the kitchen. Her presence, the only certainty that asked nothing from him but to arrive. The following day passed without urgency. There were forms to sign, colleagues to appease, and a magistrate who wanted dates and times written in neat lines. Maigret did what was necessary, but his mind was elsewhere, circling quietly around the images that had already settled in him. Ruel hunched and spent, Joris with his umbrella, trembling between pity and cowardice. The official record would mark the death as natural, the statement from Joris as voluntary, and the file would soon join the hundreds that filled the drawers. But for Maigret, the case was not only a file. It was a fragment of human life that clung to him with the dampness of the city air. When he returned home, Madame Maigret was setting plates on the table. She looked up at him with her usual calm curiosity, her eyes asking what her lips did not. He told her little, as always, but when she placed the stew in front of him, he found himself murmuring, "It was not murder." Only two men, one broken by disgrace, the other too timid to help him. She nodded once, no surprise in her face. "Most people," she said softly, "are not villains. Only tired." The words stayed with him later that night as he sat by the window, pipe in hand, watching the drizzle blur the lamps along Boulevard Richelieu. He thought of Ruel's long decline, of the pride that had hardened into desperation. He thought of Joris, living a life of precision, terrified that one mistake would drag him back into shame. Neither man had wanted tragedy. Yet tragedy had found them quietly without spectacle. An unfinished letter, an umbrella placed like a clumsy gesture of compassion, a silence heavier than any crime. By morning the case had dissolved into routine. Joris would face no prison, only questions from men in black robes, and then a life lived under the shadow of his own weakness. The shipping company would survive, adjusting its ledgers, burying its irregularities in the folds of bureaucracy. Ruel would be given a modest burial, attended perhaps by no one who truly knew him. The city would go on, its cafes full, its stations crowded, its streets glistening with rain. For Maigret, the work continued. A new call would come, another body, another room heavy with silence. Yet he carried this one with him, as he carried so many others, not as a puzzle solved, but as a reminder. Men were fragile, and their dignity was often no stronger than the fabric of an umbrella left standing in the rain. That evening, after leaving the office, he stopped once more at the Brasserie Dauphine. He took his usual table, ordered his beer, and watched the street through the fogged glass. A flower seller away last night when I saw him. He looked at me as if he wanted only to be remembered. And her voice broke. I could not speak. Durand muttered something, a curse or perhaps a plea, but it faded quickly. He looked years older. His shoulders slumped, the fight drained from him. And so he left the café in darkness, Maigret said, almost to himself, as if to remind you of what had been buried, as if to leave behind not anger, but a silence you could no longer ignore. The three of them sat in the thick air, the café too bright, too small for what had been said. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Children's voices drifted faintly from the street, life carrying on indifferent. After a long pause, Maigret rose. He placed a coin on the counter, the gesture deliberate, final. If he returns, he said softly, you will not turn him away this time. Neither Durand nor his wife answered. But in their silence he heard the truth. They would not. That evening, back at his home, Maigret ate in quiet. Madame Maigret speaking now and then about the grocer, the laundress, the neighbors' complaints. He smoked afterward in his chair, pipe glowing faintly, eyes half closed. He thought of the pale man, Henri, cousin, wanderer, waiting in the café with no lights. He had not come for wine nor for revenge, but for recognition, for someone to break the silence that had exiled him, and Maigret, as always, was left not with triumph but with a heavy understanding of human frailty. Pride, quarrels, family ties stretched thin until they broke. A man returns not to demand but to be seen. A café plunged into darkness, not by accident, but by the weight of years unsaid. When he finally rose to go to bed, he looked out the window at the boulevard, its lamps glowing dim in the wind. Life went on. Somewhere, perhaps, Henri still wandered. Perhaps he would return, perhaps not. It was no longer a matter for the police. It was a matter for the heart. Maigret tamped his pipe once more, and in the silence of the apartment, with the faint hum of Paris outside, he thought, the café had no lights, but it had no lies either. Only silence. And silence, in the end, was always the heaviest burden of all. The sky had turned the color of slate when Maigret returned once more to the Rue de la Chapelle. The street was damp from an afternoon shower, the air sharp with the smell of wet cobblestones and coal smoke. He walked slowly as though he had all the time in the world, yet with that heaviness in his step that made passers-by instinctively move aside. The lamps were just beginning to glow, their halos diffused by mist. The café door stood open, spilling yellow light onto the pavement. Inside, only two men from the garage sat hunched over their wine, their conversation halting when the inspector appeared. Durand looked up sharply from behind the counter, his moustache twitching while Madame Durand stiffened, her hands clutching at her apron as if it were an anchor. Maigret removed his hat, shook a few raindrops from it, and sat at the corner table where the pale man had once lingered. He did not order a drink this time. Instead, he lit his pipe and let the silence grow, filling the small room like smoke. At last he said in his deep, even voice, Henri. The name dropped into the silence, and neither Durand nor his wife dared move. The workmen exchanged glances but said nothing. The inspector puffed slowly, his eyes fixed on the café owners. He came here not for wine, Maigret continued. He came because silence weighs heavier than quarrels. Years ago you turned him away. He had no one else. He returned not for money but for a word, a place, a sign that he had not been forgotten. Madame Durand's face crumpled, her eyes brimming. "He was my cousin," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He had nowhere to go. I knew him the moment he stepped inside. He looked at me and I could not speak. My husband," she stopped, trembling. Durand muttered, "I did what had to be done. We had nothing to give then. He was always trouble." His words rang hollow, a man clinging to pride because it was all he had left. Maigret leaned forward, the weight of his presence bearing down. "And so he left the café in darkness, not to steal, not to destroy, but to remind you of what you had buried. He waited for you. And when you did not answer, he left again, into the rain, into the night. For a long while no one spoke. The only sound was the tick of the clock on the wall and the faint hiss of rain returning outside." The workmen shifted uneasily, their glasses untouched. At last Maigret stood, his broad figure filling the space. He placed a coin on the table as if to mark the end. "If he comes back," he said softly, "you will not turn him away this time." Neither Durand nor his wife answered. But their silence was no longer denial. It was surrender. Outside, Maigret lit his pipe again, the glow bright against the dusk. He did not know if Henry would return, nor if he had the strength to. Perhaps he had vanished once more into the shadows of Paris, one of countless men carried by the city's indifferent tide. Perhaps he would be found later, on some bench in some hospital ward, another nameless figure claimed by loneliness. But that was no longer the point. The truth had been uncovered, not through confessions or evidence, but through silence made unbearable. The café, with no lights, had held a darkness that was not of electricity but of memory. Anne Maigret, as always, had not solved a puzzle so much as exposed the quiet human weight beneath it. That evening at home, Madame Maigret served him a warm stew, and they ate in companionable silence. Later he sat in his chair, pipe in hand, watching the smoke curl lazily upward. He thought of Henri, of Madame Durand's trembling voice, of the quarrel left unresolved. He thought, too, of the countless families across Paris, each with their own silences, their own small tragedies hidden behind shutters and curtains. Outside, the rain thickened once more, pattering softly against the window. Maigret listened, weary but calm, the heaviness of the day settling into the quiet rhythm of night. He knew the world would go on as it always did, carrying its sorrows quietly, unnoticed, except by those who chose to see, and in that silence, with the city breathing steadily around him, Maigret let the case rest. It had not ended with an arrest, nor with a triumph, but with a truth, ordinary, human, and inevitable.